I understand that there are people out there who are upset, who are listening to people who are also upset, but have so far shown a lack of evidence, at least in this state, of any widespread issues.
That was Georgia election official Gabriel Sterling talking about the accuracy of the 2020 election results in his state. Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight, the new voting laws in Georgia. Joining us now, Devin Wiser. He's the executive director of the Olene Walker Institute of Politics up at Weber State University. Devin, great to have you on the show. Thanks for being here with us tonight.
Glenn, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Boy, this has really turned into a heated debate across the country. We're going to focus just nonpartisan-wise with you. Let's start by asking why these voting laws in Georgia happened in the first place.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. You have to take the whole context into play. We just came off of a very controversial and close election in Georgia where it actually flipped blue, and I think every race, both Senate races and the president race, they were all within 1 percentage point. I think President Biden beat out Trump by only 12,000 votes, and there were about 5 million ballots cast total, so it was a very close election. So temperament was high. There was a lot of spending going on. Hundreds of millions of dollars were thrown into those elections. So that was the scenario in Georgia these last few months.
Okay, and on that note, though, the Georgia Board of Elections had 3 recounts to confirm the results were accurate. Still, though, the legislature deciding to make these changes. Any subtext here?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think across the country we're seeing this movement here, and it's a matter of balancing security with access for voters. And you know, Georgia's not the only place where this is happening, and it's definitely a fine line where legislators and governors are trying to find that happy medium of not trying to freeze people out, but also making sure that our elections are safe and secure.
Let's get into some of what it does specifically. Applications for absentee ballots will start 11 weeks before an election instead of 180 days, and absentee ballots will now be mailed out later as well, 4 weeks before the election. Talk about the significance of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a matter of sort of controlling the electorate a little bit more, and you know, the most controversial provision there is the voter ID is required, which really just brings it into line with their in-person voting requirements. They've had a voter ID requirement on the statute in statute for a number of years now, so now it's just going to be for the mail-in absentee ballots as well.
Here in Utah, they go out 3 weeks. Prior to elections, so that's something we're used to here in the state of Utah.
Yeah, exactly. So we were used to that kind of quick turnaround. In Georgia, they had a little bit longer, and now it's going to be shortened up. They also increased, they increased time period for all of this as well, and there's a couple other controversial provisions in it. I don't know if you want to talk about all of those, but
yeah. Another one real quick would be the drop boxes. No longer accessible 24/7. What was some of the logic behind that?
Well, it's interesting with the drop boxes. Actually, they put them into statute. They wouldn't have been allowed in future elections without this legislation. They were just put in they were used for COVID, and I think people got used to the idea. But they also put limitations on the drop boxes. So they want them to be indoors, and they want them to be in places where they think that they can be monitored for safety, so that they can avoid, you know, ballot box stuffing. Is the concern.
Okay, early voting changes. Let's talk about that. Days have been added and time has been standardized. What's that all about?
Yeah, so early voting. So this is the reason why, you know, elected officials there are saying that they're actually expanding access to voting. And particularly this will affect rural counties. They're going to give them more access and more days. And things that you know, there was a time period when they were talking about getting rid of voting on Sundays, and they didn't add that to the legislation. So that was one thing that didn't get in, that people on the far right actually wanted to be in. So they sort of tried to find a happy medium there.
Let's move to the state election board. It will no longer be run by the Secretary of State. That's a big change. Instead, the state legislature will nominate a chair and create a board to oversee the elections, which can take over election offices and limit drop boxes as well. So dig into that for us. Explain that.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to note here and just kind of keep the full context that, you know, the state of Georgia and their legislature and their governor, they're all run by Republicans, and the legislature is pretty pretty much dominated by Republicans too. So that, this is them sort of signaling their power and sort of taking that and wanting to show their voters that they are emphasizing election security and integrity.
Okay, finally, one of the ones really being talked about is this not being able to electioneer within 150 feet of a polling location. And one of the things that people are really narrowing in on and focusing on is this issue of water and food being delivered to people in line. Tell us, who can and who can't, and the reasoning behind that.
Yeah, so as you noted, this has been super controversial. Basically, they're just prohibiting partisan groups from distributing food and drink while within 150 feet, I think it is, of the ballot box and the voting locations. Clearly, they're trying to stop people from trying to persuade people by bribing them with bottles of water, food, things like that. However, poll workers will still be allowed to distribute food and water as they see fit. There's nothing in the law that's banning that, and people of course can bring their own food and snacks.
And are you surprised to see the upheaval of this specific and the focus on this part of the law at all?
It's been interesting. It doesn't differ that much from many other states out there. There's a lot of provisions in law that are trying to prevent partisan groups from sort of harassing people in the ballot or in the line to vote. So yeah, it is a little bit surprising to see that the sort of the amount of media attention that this has been given. But I think given the context that we have of this, such a hotly contested election last year, I think it's not that surprising.
Yeah, a lot of these issues obviously being defined or interpreted based on political background, no doubt about that. Okay, We've been hearing from Devon Weiser. He's the executive director of the Walker Institute at Weber State University. Devin, great to have you on the show. We appreciate your insight. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for staying with us for our In Focus discussion tonight on the new voting laws in Georgia. Joining us now to dig into these laws and the controversy, we have Representative Brian King. He's a Democrat representing Salt Lake City. And via Zoom, Senator Todd Weiler, a Republican representing the Woods Cross area. Gentlemen, great to have you back. The session kept us away for a while.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
It's good to be back.
All right, let's dig into this. This is really just ignited a firestorm all across the country. I just want to first get into your overall impressions of this bill. What are you thinking about it? Let's start with you, Senator Weiler.
Well, I think there's probably a few things to be concerned about, especially the timing and the motivation for the bill. But I do believe that the president, especially, and the Democratic Party in particularly, have been overreacting. I think it's been intentional. I think they want the federal government to step into this space. I don't think they respect state rights in general, but specifically with elections, I don't think they trust Republican-leaning states to make their own laws. And I think that this is an overreaction so that Congress can sweep in and say, we can't trust the states, so the federal government's going to decide what the voting laws will be, and then they'll try to cram things like ballot harvesting and other things down our throats.
Representative King, your response to that?
Well, it's not surprising that Senator Weiler and I disagree a little bit about that. What you've got here is a solution in search of a problem. The only reason that this is happening in Georgia and Texas and other states is because Democrats won in very close elections in a hotly contested presidential election last year. And the Republicans don't like it. They're coming back to try and figure out ways to reduce the turnout from Democrats, and they think by suppressing the vote, putting obstacles, putting hindrances in place to people voting, that they're going to have their base turn out at greater numbers than the Democrats. I think that's actually an error. And there are a lot of Republicans that I've heard, political strategists, who have said this is going to backfire. It's going to cause people who want to go to the polls and find these things being obstacles even more intent on making sure that they get out and have their voice heard and they are able to cast their ballots.
Senator, weigh in on the representative's thought there that this is a solution in search of a problem, because Republican election officials, they recounted 3 times. They insist to this day there was no fraud that took place in the election. So why was there a need for the Republican legislature to go take on these laws and make the changes they did?
You know, I'm not in the Georgia legislature, but I am in the Utah legislature, and we revise our election law every 1 to 2 years. Part of that's technology, part of it's changing federal laws, part of it was vote by mail, part of it was COVID, COVID measures. And so I'm not going to criticize the legislature for updating their election laws. I know that that's brought it in. But this national narrative that we're all supposed to buy into, that everyone's racist, and the president saying that this is Jim Crow law, when his own state of Delaware requires voter ID, and it requires each voter's name and political party to be stated out loud so anyone in the precinct can challenge them. That's what Delaware does. No one's calling that racist.
Okay,
and I think there's a lot of doublespeak going on here.
We're going to dig into that a little bit more in our next segment, but since that has come up, Representative, that is one of the big issues here, requiring ID, and a poll recently from the Associated Press indicates that some 74% of Americans are in favor of that, say that should be a requirement to vote in this country.
Right. Well, certainly we want to make sure that we have fair elections that are free of fraud. We want to make sure that there's integrity associated with our elections. And we do have those kind of elections right now. That's the problem that Republicans have in defending these laws, is they can't show that there's been any meaningful degree of fraud anywhere in the country. And yet all of a sudden, after a close election in 2020, when they lose some key states, they want to come along in those particular states and try to change the rules.
But Representative, dig into why showing ID is a problem to some.
Oh, I think the problem is that requiring showing of ID disproportionately impacts people who are poor, disproportionately impacts people who don't have access to resources. For most people, it's not a problem, but there's no showing that there is a need to show ID in order to avoid fraud.
Senator, your thoughts on that?
Well, there's a lot of blue states that require ID, and the voter law actually in Georgia says if you're mailing in your ballot, you can either use your driver's license number or your social security number, or I think the last 4 digits, or a third option. And so, again, I think thou protestest too much. I think there's a narrative here. They're trying to say that everyone in Georgia who voted for this is racist, and they want Congress to step in and save us all from these states that can't be trusted. And I think if you compare the new Georgia law to Wisconsin, to Delaware, to New Jersey, to a lot of other states, what they're doing is pretty much right in line. And to have the President of the United States lie about it and say that they're closing polls at 5 p.m. when people are just getting off of work, that's a bald-faced lie. And the White House is protecting him, and the President has never recanted that lie.
Representative, is the President lying to the American people about this law?
No, he's not lying. He was mistaken.
Well, does the Georgia law require polls to close
No,
at
look,
5?
he misstated something.
No, he said it repeatedly over a number of weeks, and he's never corrected himself.
Well,
so how should they handle that then moving forward, Representative?
Well, I think that, when you make a misstatement, if there are misstatements made, you need to own up to it and say, I misstated that, I erred. There's nothing intentional wrong about this. Nobody doubts that Georgia's laws are in fact putting obstacles and restrictions in place that weren't there before. That's unequivocal. The senator would admit to that.
Is that a true statement? Does the senator admit to that?
I didn't hear the statement. I'm sorry.
That everyone can look at this and say what this is about is putting obstacles in front of voters instead of making it easier to get out and make your voice heard.
I absolutely disagree with that. In fact, there would have been no collection ballot boxes because the COVID law was set to expire, and the new law not only creates ballot collection boxes, but it also allows, if there's more than an hour wait in a precinct, they can open up nearby precincts to allow relief for those lines. There's a lot of good things in this law that the media, the national media, and the Democratic Party is overlooking, trying to convince everyone. Most people aren't going to read a 100-page bill. So they're going to read the headlines and think, oh my goodness, we need Congress to save us.
Yeah, and that could even include some of the people that vote on it as well. All right, let's push the pause button right there. We're going to be right back and continue this discussion because there's still a lot more to get into. Stay with us. Thanks for staying with us. Let's pick up right where we left off with State Representative Brian King and State Senator Todd Weiler. Gentlemen, thanks for sticking around. Let's get right to this issue that a lot of people are narrowing in on, and that's this part of the law that states you cannot provide food or water to those within 150 feet of a polling location. Why are so many people narrowing in on this, and what is the Democratic perspective on it, Representative?
Well, the reason that people are upset is that it's very well established over a long period of time that lines are longest in Georgia in those communities of color that are minority communities, relatively poor communities, communities that don't have the resources that more affluent communities have. And so you have people waiting in line for 2, 3, 4 hours at times to vote. If they don't have access on a hot day or on any day to food and water, a lot of them are just going to say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to show up. This is a way, again, of suppressing the vote, of putting in obstacles to people getting out and being able to vote comfortably. There are going to be a certain number of people, of course, that will show up. More power to them. But there are going to be a certain number of people that will be deterred and will not show up. It's all on the margins. If you can reduce the turnout in those kind of districts by 10, 5, 15%, it could very well make the difference in a close election.
Senator Weiler, your thoughts on that provision? Will it turn people away?
No, it won't, Glenn. I've been voting in every election since the 1980s. I've never been offered food or drink in line. If you read the actual bill, which I doubt Representative King has done, it actually has a section about talking about political campaigning to people who are standing in line about to vote. And so what the law says is you can't have someone in a Joe Biden t-shirt handing out Coke and hamburgers. And that makes sense. We don't want voters to be bribed. The bill specifically says that polling places can have water fountains. And so again, the media is taking an anti-bribery provision and they're trying to turn it around. How many people in November need a drink while they're waiting in line to vote? And how many of your listeners, Glenn, have been offered food or water while they've been standing in line to vote? It's never happened to me. And we're not talking about the heat of July. We're talking about November, the first week in November.
I want to move on to a quote from President Biden. You already alluded to this earlier, Senator. Let's take a listen real fast.
This makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle. I mean, this is gigantic, what they're trying to do, and it cannot be sustained.
Representative, is this reminiscent of Jim Crow era voting rules?
Well, these were the rules that were in place for decades, generations, in fact, all throughout the South, in which there were obstacles and hindrances put in place for people of color. And yes, this is disproportionately impacting those communities. No, there's no doubt that that's going to be true. You do have longer lines, much longer lines at those communities, in those communities, and at those polling places than you do at more affluent polling places. Why would you put restrictions in place on the ability to provide food and water, electioneering aside? It does restrict food and water unless you were trying to suppress the vote.
Senator, your thoughts on the president's statement?
Well, I think the president is absolutely wrong. I think he doesn't realize, A, what the Georgia election law contains, and B, that in many states, his own state of Delaware is worse, where your actual political party is shouted out loud in the precinct and your name so people can challenge you. And C, this myth, this false narrative that minorities cannot vote across the country is a lie. It's a misrepresentation, and it's an invitation for Congress to ride in on its white horse and save the day because we can't trust states. It's a disrespect of state rights, and Georgia, the legislature in Georgia, has every right to update their election laws.
All right, now to a quote from Senator Mitt Romney, Utah Senator Romney, during the week, really taking aim at the responsibility of the media. I want to hit on a specific part of this. He says most spread partisan disinformation and inflamed passions and division. Is that how you've seen this argument play out, Representative?
No. Look, I mean, there's no question that there are two sides to this, and there are people who are in favor of these bills, generally Republicans, generally conservatives, and they try to spin it in a way that makes it seem like a reasonable protection against voter fraud. But the reality is they have a hard time demonstrating that there's any meaningful voter fraud at all going on. So why are they making these laws now? We know why. It's because they lost close elections to Democrats in states that have traditionally been Republican, and they want to get that advantage for Republican voters back in their ballpark.
Senator, your thoughts on what our U.S. Senator from Utah had to say?
Well, I agree with the good senator 100%. And while I don't believe there was widespread voter fraud in Georgia or any other state that would have changed tens of thousands of votes, I do believe that there is individual instances of voter fraud in every state. And I think that Representative King would agree with that. But more importantly, we listened to the national media for 2.5 years tell us every day that Trump stole the election, that the election was hacked, and that Russia interfered. And then now, 4 years later, we're supposed to believe that anyone that mentions or mumbles voter fraud is somehow insane. And I've never seen such a flip-flop from the media, the national media, in my entire life.
Boy, there's a lot more I'd like to dig into, but unfortunately, we have run out of time. I appreciate both of you and your insight. Very interesting conversation, no doubt about that. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn.